it's now 3 o'clock Finnish time, so I think we'll start this FIIA climate briefing number 8, where we are going to talk about where is the climate agenda heading, COP27 from a global and European perspective. So welcome to this webinar. My name is Emma Hakala. I'm a senior research fellow here at FIIA. And indeed, today we will talk about the COP27 meeting, which just ended last weekend in Sharm El-Sheikh in Egypt. And you may have already heard some of the results from there. Of course, the meeting came after or during a very difficult year, but also following previous COP meetings, climate meetings that have been very difficult and taken place during kind of crisis situations due to the pandemic. And then, of course, this year we've had the Russian war of attack in Ukraine, and of course the energy crisis and the global geopolitical situation, which has been in a kind of a change, to say the least. So this has not made the setting for the meeting in Sharm El-Sheikh any easier this time. So today our plan is to talk about the results of the meeting and to kind of understand the major maybe shortcomings as well and the stumbling blocks of the COP27. But then we will also take a kind of a broader perspective where we reflect the COP27 and its results on the surrounding geopolitical situation, geopolitical competition, and the potential for economic recession and rising energy and food prices, how these are kind of reflected or were reflected in the COP27 meeting, and how we will move onwards from here. And we'll also take a kind of a European perspective with regard to the EU's climate and energy framework, and how this will be adapted to the recent developments, and how maybe the COP27 process can be taken into account in those considerations. So very difficult topics, but luckily today we have two very good experts to talk about these issues with us. I think some of the best we could find on this specific issue. So as the main speaker, we have Oras Tynkkynen, who is an expert on climate and energy policy and sustainability, and he is currently serving as a senior advisor senior advisor and chair of the board at Tyrsky Consulting, and he's also a senior advisor at the Finnish Innovation Fund, Sitra. So welcome, Oras, and thank you for joining us. And then we also have my colleague here at FIIA, so Marco Siddi, who is a senior research fellow here at FIIA. He's also Montalcini assistant professor at the University of Cagliari in Italy. And he focuses on EU-Russia relations and EU energy and climate policy. So we'll hear from him after Oras. And before I let you start, I'll just tell the audience that after the short presentations from these two guys, we will start a discussion where you can also contribute by writing your questions in the chat, and I will then place them to the speakers. But without further ado, I'll give the floor to Oras. So please go ahead.
Well, thank you, Emma. Thank you for having me, and also greetings from what is a surprisingly snowy Stockholm. I hope you can see my presentation already. What I will be trying to do in the coming minutes is to unpack what happened at the Egypt climate conference and what it means. I should at the outset really acknowledge that it is a bit of an a bit of a mission impossible to try to squeeze into about 20 minutes or so everything that happened, or even the most meaningful parts of what happened at the COP. Please excuse me if I don't address all the important issues. I also recognize that there are many really excellent experts joining us today, so please do correct me if you notice that I have misunderstood something that happened. I thought that I should perhaps take a very meta approach to begin with, which is to try to understand how to unpack, how to analyze, how to evaluate these different UN climate conferences, because in my experience, that has turned out to be surprisingly difficult. And then deal with the actual results that came out of Egypt, and finally discuss a bit the politics or even the geopolitics of the climate conference, as well as some of the next steps. Now, hold on to your hats, because I have quite a lot of stuff to cover in not so many minutes. The first point I would like to make about these unruly monsters that are UN climate conferences is that they have become almost unmanageably huge. And I mean that both logistically in terms of the sheer number of people joining these events, as well as the complexity of the agenda they are trying to address in a little less than 2 weeks. And that also means it is a huge challenge to try to grasp the entirety of the results of these conferences. And I, at least, I'm very humble about to what extent I can reasonably try to do that, but I'll of course do my best. My second point would be that in my experience, it might be helpful to try to understand UN climate conferences not as one conference, but rather basically two different meetings. The first part, of course, is the official intergovernmental negotiations taking place between parties, that is different countries, and dealing with different climate agreements. But the second part is increasingly important as well, and that is basically everything else that happens at these conferences or around these conferences by investors, local government, civil society, businesses, and so on. And I raise this here because in my experience, if you only focus on one aspect of the conference, you are probably going to miss out on possibly important developments, and you will not get a full picture of whether these conferences achieved anything or not. Then finally, in my experience, immediately after the COPs, you have a lot of hot takes about what happened and whether the conference was a disaster or a breakthrough. And sometimes, interestingly enough, you might get them from the very same outlets. So in this case, The Guardian, where you had an editorial talking about a real achievement, and then at the same time an environment correspondent saying that basically at the Egypt COP, the 1.5 degree climate goal died. So you have these relatively extreme interpretations of what happened. I think oftentimes as time goes by and as the dust settles, you come more closer to kind of a convergence of opinions and analysis, and you can perhaps more calmly look at both the pros and cons of these conferences. Now, bearing this in mind, what can we say about the results of the Egypt COP? I should probably start with the item or the issue that dominated our headlines, which is loss and damage. And for those of you who have not been following these negotiations, loss and damage basically means the impacts of global heating on people and ecosystems that cannot be addressed through adaptation. So it's basically kind of the residual damage caused by global heating. And it has been a politically a very contested topic for years. Now, finally, it was elevated to the official climate conference agenda. There was a decision to establish a dedicated fund to address loss and damage. What that fund means is partly something that remains to be seen. The intention possibly is to focus on the most vulnerable countries in the global south, also trying to expand the range of sources available for funding. Whether that happens, we will find out later. It will take years to actually come to a point where that fund starts to deliver any financing to the recipients. There has been also some critical discussion about whether establishing a fund really is what the world's most vulnerable people need at this point, recognizing that there is no certainty about any money in that fund yet. But there have been some pledges that we heard at the Egypt COP from countries like Austria, Germany, New Zealand, basically saying that they are willing to contribute relatively modest amounts of money to address loss and damage, but it's a start. This is a relatively new area of climate finance, so it is promising to see these pledges coming as we saw in Egypt. Now, whereas we saw arguably significant progress on loss and damage, there was hardly any when it comes to mitigation, which is basically tackling the climate crisis through reducing emissions. The so-called cover decision of COP27 basically just repeats what was already stated a year ago at the COP26 in Glasgow. There were attempts by some countries to set a target for peaking emissions that failed. However, there was a work program launched that was already decided to be established a year ago. Now it has some meat on its bones, but what kind of meat? Quite interesting. I will have one example of that. And something that has been going under the radar for most analysts and especially media is what is called the global stocktake. It is a feature under the Paris Agreement to come back and review the progress made on achieving the targets under the Paris Agreement every 5 years. And now, according to this Paris Agreement schedule, the global stocktake should come up with its conclusions next year at the next COP. And at the Egypt COP, there was some progress on taking this work forward. But looking at the extent countries are willing to go to avoid reducing emissions more, this is a piece from the mitigation work program decision, and it basically underlines time and time again that whatever discussions take place under this mitigation work program should not in any way interfere with what national governments are willing to do on emission targets. And it even explicitly says that none of this work under the mitigation work program should impose new targets or goals. So on the one hand, you have a process established under the Paris Agreement to raise the ambition of emission reductions. And on the other, countries are saying that whatever comes out of this process should not be interpreted as requiring countries to do more. And this is not particularly promising, as you can imagine, for reducing emissions. In Glasgow a year ago at COP26, the countries decided that they would call on themselves, that is countries, to come up with updated, more ambitious, nationally determined contributions, NDCs, or simply national emission targets. Sadly, very few countries actually heeded that call and came up with their updated NDCs by the Egypt COP. These countries do include some fairly significant players such as Mexico and Vietnam and Turkey. However, this takes us only baby steps in the right direction, that is bridging the emission gap we have currently from the pathways we are on today with current pledges to where we need to be to actually get to the Paris Agreement goals of limiting global heating to well below 2 degrees, let alone 1.5. Financing has basically always been one of the most controversial and important topics at these negotiations. But it's interesting to note how this discussion on financing seems to be evolving, I would argue. The EU tried to put on the agenda of COP27 something that is very rarely known about the Paris Agreement, which is that there is a particular article saying that we should basically align all financial flows with our climate targets. And EU wanted this to be on the official agenda. This request was declined. But what came out of the COP27 in the end was a decision to start a dialogue on this very same topic. So it allows countries to have a discussion about aligning international financial flows with climate targets. What that delivers in the end, or if it delivers, again remains to be seen, but it is a starting point. Interestingly enough, if you look at the cover decision coming from Egypt, there is, for instance, a call to transform the financial system and its structures and processes. And this is new language, at least in the climate negotiations. Basically, there seems to be a growing appetite to have a critical look at the global financial system and possibly consider some possibly quite systemic changes to that system. And this is actually echoing what some countries, especially in the global south, have been calling for quite some time. I think one of the most prominent initiatives has been coming from the Prime Minister of Barbados, who has been talking about what is called Bridgetown Agenda or Initiative, basically saying that we need some more far-reaching changes to the financial system, and we need new ways, new mechanisms to raise international climate finance. And now this discourse is actually reflected in the official decision of the UN Climate Conference. Another thing to note perhaps of the finance discussions is that there is this new emerging vehicle for providing international climate finance that has been gaining traction over the past 2 years. We saw this already a year ago in Glasgow when South Africa and some international financial institutions and partners decided to basically come up with a package to allow for South Africa to transition faster out of coal power into low carbon energy sources. And now this example has been replicated with Indonesia, and there are plans to do the same for countries like India and Senegal in the future. If these just energy transition plans, as they are called, turn out to be successful, they could have a meaningful impact on global emissions because it is really the energy transition in the countries like South Africa and Indonesia that needs to be sped up considerably, and hopefully these plans can do just that. What happened in Glasgow and was repeated in Egypt this time is that there was this, what I call, and we can debate this, essentially a sideshow on fossil fuels. And I'm saying it's a sideshow because it basically deals with the cover decision of the COP. And if you ask legal experts like Kati Kulovesi, they will tell you that the cover decision is not legally binding in any way or fashion. And even if countries said in the cover decision that we will phase out fossil fuels tomorrow, that has very little impact on real life action. But it is interesting to the media because it's more concrete. It deals with something that is more understandable than many of these other discussions that take place at COPs. What India did in Egypt was to propose that basically countries should call for phasing down all fossil fuels and not only coal, which is what we got out of Glasgow a year ago. And this proposal got the support of around 80 countries, both in the global north and global south. It did not fly in the end, but it is notable that for the first time, such a large collection of countries was calling for phasing down all fossil fuels. So it is a development that we have not seen before. In the end, what we got from the cover decision was no progress, but no backsliding either when it comes to fossil fuels. Speaking of fossil fuels, some countries did use the climate conference quite ironically also to have side deals with some fossil fuel producers about delivering energy. For instance, Germany and Egypt signed a deal on producing and exporting more liquefied natural gas to Europe. Now, this was in a very small nutshell some of the key outcomes of the COP. I neglected many important areas such as the Article 6 market mechanisms, for instance, or the global goal on adaptation. But finally, let me just touch upon the politics of the meeting and some of the next steps. I think many went into the COP this year expecting the very challenging global geopolitical situation to have an impact on the negotiations. And I would argue that actually we saw quite little of that in the negotiations themselves. Russia's presence was not particularly prominent, and the turbulence around Russia's war of aggression against Ukraine and Europe did not really materialize very much in the climate discussions. Actually, quite the contrary, we saw some promising signs of the US and China coming back to their bilateral dialogue on climate action they have had over the past years. That was temporarily interrupted by Speaker Pelosi's visit to Taiwan. Now the talks have been resumed, and that is a good sign. It is also interesting to look at the role of the European Union, and I think I oftentimes am quite critical of the role the EU has played, simply because I am an EU citizen and I feel that I can require more of people who represent me in these negotiations. I would say that the EU was playing a prominent and constructive role in Egypt. And one of the most prominent initiatives it took was on loss and damage specifically. The EU came up with a compromise proposal to meet some of the requirements of the Global South, to establish a loss and damage fund, but it also wanted a fund with some specific conditions and requirements that would make sure that it would be better fit for purpose. And it wanted this fund, the decision on this loss and damage fund, to be coupled with more stringent action on reducing emissions. So I think it found a very interesting compromise proposal that hopefully contributed to the outcome in the end. However, it's also interesting to note that the EU explicitly said that they would be willing and ready to walk out of the negotiations if the result was not to their liking. If you read the outcome that actually came from the COP, I would argue that it is in many ways quite far from what the EU was calling for. And nevertheless, the EU did accept this end result. And I think it's an interesting tactical choice. Whether it's right or wrong, it's difficult to say at this point. I think the EU basically calculated that even though the outcome is not to their liking, it is better to go along with it at this point and then hopefully use the credit and the trust that supporting this outcome hopefully created with the Global South in the following years in following negotiations, and build on this achievement achieved in Egypt when there are other issues to be negotiated in coming COPs. One slide about the host country, the presidency of the COP, Egypt. It was criticized on a wide range of topics, starting from practical things like poor logistics, ranging to human rights concerns, concerns about surveillance of conference participants, and even intimidation. In terms of the negotiations, it seemed that Egypt lacked both skills and interest to run these negotiations successfully. Many seasoned observers who have been around for a long time, observing various different presidencies, did rate Egypt's performance very unfavorably compared with many preceding presidencies. And the presidency is supposed to take an impartial role, bringing countries together on these very difficult topics. And at least countries in the global north argue that Egypt failed to do that, and it took sides very clearly. The next COP, COP28, that is going to be held in early December next year in the United Arab Emirates, Dubai to be more precise. And this has been getting mixed judgments from various analysts. I would just say that the United Arab Emirates may be better than its reputation when it comes to hosting an important meeting of such kind. The UAE has more capacity by far than countries like Egypt, so it may be in a fairly good position to lead those negotiations. We will, of course, know more in a year. Just to leave you with one final, very fundamental note, even after Egypt, we are quite far from the goal of limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees. We need much stronger pledges and commitments from countries, and even more importantly, perhaps we need much more implementation of all these different pledges and targets to get to that goal. And we are very much running out of time. Business as usual will not do. I noticed that I've taken quite a lot of time already, so perhaps just stop here in the interest of time and then get back to the discussion after Marco's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Oras. Thank you so much. And don't worry about the time. I mean, I think this was a very excellent and impressive summary of the results and takeaways from COP27. It was very clear and fascinating to follow. But we will indeed continue to discuss those issues in a moment. But first, we'll let Marco speak and comment, of course, on Oras's points and also present some of his own. So please go ahead, Marco.
Thank you, Emma, and thanks, Oras, for the excellent presentation. So what I want to do is present a little bit the European side of the story, or better, how the European Union arrived at COP27, what was happening in the last 1-2 years. So to do that, I will try to share my screen with you and a PowerPoint presentation, which is very much based on my latest FIIA working paper, which is titled Assessing the European Union's REPowerEU Plan, Energy Transition Meets Geopolitics. So I will try to very briefly sketch the main developments in the last 2 years and what the ongoing war in Ukraine means for the European Union and for EU energy and climate policy. So a bit of introduction to begin with. So as by now everyone knows, even out of personal experience, the EU has been experiencing an energy crisis for well over a year, a crisis that became more acute in recent months. And that started due to tight global energy supply in the context of post-COVID recovery. The crisis was aggravated by a progressive reduction of Russian gas supplies. Russia reduced sales of gas on the spot market and halted them altogether in October 2021, so well before the war in Ukraine started, or before its February 2022 aggression. At the same time, there were also other factors. The effects of the climate crisis became more acute, and this also had an impact on EU energy production, and specifically in hydropower production and wind power production in various areas of the continent. So especially the weaker hydropower is a result, or can be seen as a result, of the worsening climate crisis. Also, a little bit more of background to understand how EU's climate policy evolved in this period. In late 2019, the European Green Deal was announced, and in the following 2 years, until May 2021, the two main milestones of the Green Deal in terms of mitigation were announced, specifically a carbon neutrality target by the year 2050 was codified in the European climate law, and an interim, so a midterm target for 2030 was also decided. The target was that the EU would cut greenhouse gas emissions by at least 55% by the year 2030 compared to the year 1990. The European Green Deal is a roadmap. It's a very complicated roadmap which involves most, if not all, aspects of European economy. So before the energy crisis escalated and before Russia attacked Ukraine, one of the key topics was carbon border adjustment. So the European Union devised a scheme, sort of carbon border tax, to ensure that there would be no carbon leakage. So to make sure that industrial production would not leave Europe to find to relocate in places, in countries with weaker environmental standards. And so the debate was about the impact that CBAM would have. The plan is that CBAM will be phased in starting in 2026 and apply especially to a range of energy-intensive products. Here you see a table of these products and also the main trade partners of the European Union where EU imports originate. So this was the debate, and there was discussion about the financial impact and the impact on EU's relations with trade partners. And there was also quite a bit of concern, but actually the issue was not as big as what happened later, actually. So here you see some estimates that I took from a report by the E3G that calculated the impact of the carbon border adjustment mechanism on imports from trade partners. Still, before the war, another important step in EU energy and climate policy was the adoption of the Fit for 55 package, which reiterated the 55% greenhouse gas reduction targets and also included new targets for renewable energy and energy efficiency, and a set of proposals concerning sustainable transport and making maritime and aviation transportation less impactful. So meanwhile, the energy crisis escalated, but it got a lot worse following Russia's attack on Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022. And this was because so Russia had already started to decrease energy supplies to the European Union, specifically gas supplies. Following the start of the war, energy became part of the confrontation with Russia. In the EU, the perspective that energy trade was fueling Russia's war machine became prevalent. Pretty soon, just around 2 weeks after the beginning of the war, the European Commission announced that it would cut Russian gas imports by 2/3 by the end of the year. And then in the following months, a ban on imports of Russian coal was announced, followed by a partial oil embargo that would, however, cover most of the oil imports from Russia. Meanwhile, Gazprom, so Russia tried to impose payments in rubles for gas deliveries and cut off supplies to countries, to EU members that refuse this mechanism, and reduce supplies to others. So by, as you can see in this graph, which shows the flows of Russian gas to the European Union, to Europe, divided based on import corridors. So you see that especially at the end of the spring, gas flows began to decrease, and especially gas flows via Nord Stream, which are shown in blue and black in this graph. So going back to European policies, in May 2022, the European Commission presented or perfected actually its Repower EU plan, which had already been introduced in March. Now, this is quite a complex plan. Once again, the key aspects are the reduction of gas imports from Russia, the proposal of a new renewable energy target, more focus on energy efficiency and saving, and an increased focus on renewables, specifically photovoltaic capacity, wind power, and plans to increase biofuel and hydrogen production. At the same time, due to the war and the EU's response to it, the necessity to import fossil fuels, and particularly gas from other providers, came up. So the Repower EU plan foresees 50 additional billion cubic meters of gas imports to the European Union. And there's also plans that, however, remain more vague about expanding pipeline imports. Oil consumption increased. So in the short run, even though higher energy prices meant that energy consumption went down at an economic cost, of course, at the same time, we also saw some steps back in terms of partial return to coal, and plans to construct, to build new fossil fuel infrastructure, such as LNG terminals, to replace Russian pipeline gas. I'm probably running out of time already, or quite close to it. Let me just say very briefly through a few graphs. The European Union has been reducing imports of gas from Russia. Here you see Russia's shares. Well, the last chart relates to the second quarter of 2022, but you can already see a reduction when it comes to gas and to oil. This reduction will continue in the latter part of 2022. At the same time, we did not see a reduction in Russian revenues for now, or at least in the up to mid-2022, because while volumes decreased, prices went up so much that Russia was still able to reap huge profits out of gas and oil imports. So just a few more things when it comes to liquefied natural gas, because I think this has not been stressed sufficiently. So the geopolitical necessity of shifting away from Russian gas, however, means additional investments in LNG terminals, so in fossil fuel infrastructure, with the risk that this infrastructure becomes stranded assets if the EU continues as it plans on its path to decarbonization. So this means that even investing in this infrastructure in the short term is not really attractive for private investors, and the public sector will have to step in. On top of this, there are several issues related to the fact that LNG, while the process of production and transporting LNG and regasifying it tends to be more polluting than pipeline gas. So, and of course, the cost of LNG also tends to be higher than pipeline gas, at least in normal circumstances. So what does it mean? What does this all mean for the European Union? And trying to link the energy and the climate side of the story. Well, in political terms, I mean, this is a huge topic that I just mentioned briefly here. Russia has been the largest energy provider to the European Union, and this is changing. So there is a very important, strong political dimension to the story. In terms of economic consequences, as I said, and as everyone knows, energy prices increased unprecedentedly, especially in the summer. This had an impact on European industrial production, on European society, which is likely to continue in the winter and most likely in the next year. On top of this, there were several new policies introduced, let's say unilaterally, by various global actors, which also have an impact on the EU and the energy transition in the European Union. One of the latest developments is the Inflation Reduction Act in the US, which very simply gives major tax breaks for investments in green technology. And this has begun to attract European green funding to the US. So at the time when that funding is very much needed in the European Union to accelerate the energy transition and reduce dependence on Russian fossil fuels. So there is a problem of coordination even between natural allies. At the same time, we can say that an increase, especially a sustained in time increase in EU LNG imports will mean that less LNG will be available on the market for other importers, for example, in the global south, which might be pushed back to coal consumption. Overall, these developments have led to very highly dysfunctional outcomes for the European economy and for European energy security. And geopolitical confrontation most likely will aggravate disagreements and impact on the multilateral framework more broadly, including future negotiations on climate change. Okay, I stop here. I had a map on scenarios, but maybe I can come back to this in the discussion.
Yes, thank you, Marco, and thanks. That was very fascinating as well on the EU side of things, and I think that now we have a perfect sort of background for further discussion on this. And indeed, I would encourage our audience, because as Oras said, I know that there are many experts on these topics also in the audience, so it would be really interesting to hear your points of view and questions. So please write them in the chat. I will then pick them from there. But while we're waiting for questions from the audience, I will take the chance to ask something from our experts here. And one thing that I think kept sort of or popped up in both of your presentations is, of course, the issue of these geopolitical tensions that have been increased with Russia's war in Ukraine. And of course, the overall overarching geopolitical shifts that have then taken place as a result of that. And Oras mentioned that this is not really visible or was not visible in the COP27 meeting, at least in the sort of negotiations level. But how concerned should we be that this geopolitical tension will then feed into the climate negotiation process as well, and maybe start to sort of complicate future conferences and future decision making about climate policy globally? I think I can let you both answer, but we will start with Oras.
Yes, indeed. I think these geopolitical tensions manifested themselves surprisingly little in the actual climate negotiations at the COP. However, I think it may be possible that there are more indirect routes at play here. And why I say that is that international climate negotiations are really based on trust, and the lack of trust is often the key obstacle to making progress in the negotiations. And oftentimes this trust or lack thereof is basically between the global north and the global south. And this has been an issue for a long time. One could ask whether what the EU and the global north did during the pandemic helped to build that trust between the global north and the global south, or actually reduced that trust. If we imagine an alternative scenario in which the global north would have made vaccines available broadly at affordable prices to the global south, would that had an impact on climate negotiations? Of course, impossible to tell for sure, but I think it's a fair question to ask. Then another thing I would like to point out here is that I think what we saw in Egypt was kind of the increasing emergence of this multipolar world that many international policy experts have been talking about for a long time. And I think it kind of underlines the importance of these kind of mid-range players, whether it's countries like Egypt or Qatar or Turkey or Brazil. I think these countries in the global south seem to be taking an increasing role in some of these discussions, and I think we may have seen some of that in Egypt as well.
Yeah, thank you for that. That was very illuminating. Marco, please go ahead, and actually, if you want to show your slide with the scenarios, please feel free to do so.
Yes, thank you, Emma. I hope you were able to listen to my presentation until the end, because my computer decided to restart at the very end. So actually I had to switch devices. I don't have the presentation on my tablet. But I can say a few things. So answering your question to begin with, I agree with everything Oras said. And of course, he has a better overview of COP27 than I do. At the same time, I also think that growing geopolitical tensions do not bode well for the multilateral cooperation that is necessary in many fields, exactly for this question of trust, but also because of spillovers that may affect cooperation. At least in the European Union, there was, in my opinion, a clear impact. The geopolitical crisis, and especially the war in Ukraine, has taken most, if not nearly all, media attention. So there was a lot less attention on urgent climate issues. There was hardly any or very little discussion about climate events such as the flooding of large parts of Pakistan. So what is missing after all? I mean, there is a shift of attention, and societal attention is not, societal pressure is not as strong as it could be. And this also allows governments to possibly focus on the short term rather than on long-term climate goals. Regarding the scenarios, actually, this is it's a table that I borrowed from a paper published in 2020, which showed various scenarios, starting with the optimal one, which is a global Green Deal, going through, well, dirty nationalism is the worst. And so the scenarios focus on multilateral cooperation, or on the other hand, the fragmentation of climate action into clubs. And I would say that the scenario in which we are in at the moment is muddling on. So there is a linear progress in climate policy. I mean, of course, with many differences from countries to countries, but overall, we don't see the acceleration that is necessary to meet the goal of 1.5 degrees. I mean, it's a complex question, of course, but I will stop here and let's see if there are questions.
Thank you, Marco. And in a way, I would like to get back later on to the issue of global north and south, which Oras brought up. But maybe let's, because we have questions in the chat from the audience, so let's take these at least first and then see later on. So these are actually both for specifically for Oras. First, we have a question from Hannes Tuovini, who asks about the removals. So there were seemingly topped up agenda of COP27 side events on removals. How would you comment on this? Do you see removals, so CDR, are gaining momentum to become the third pillar in parallel to mitigation and adaptation? So please take that already. Yeah, please answer.
Yeah, I do see removals gaining in prominence in international climate discussions, and that is the direct result of failing to reduce emissions fast enough. And this is very much linked to the lively discussion about whether limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees is even possible at this stage anymore. And that depends largely on how much we can realistically invest in carbon removal. So I do think that carbon removals have gained a prominence, and they will continue to gain prominence as we go to the future. I would also add that following the same logic, I think we will see an emerging discussion on climate engineering. So these are different methods such as solar radiation management that could theoretically help us in scenarios in which we have blown past our carbon budget. We are going way beyond 1.5 degrees, perhaps way beyond 2 degrees, and we still, as humanity, feel that we need to limit the level of heating, and then you start discussing these climate engineering possibilities with various risks and challenges, just to keep it very short.
Yeah, that's a good point, and good that you brought up also that topic. Then, and just as a side note to the audience, please feel free to ask more questions. But we also have a question from Seppo Määttä, again to Oras. How would you describe the tones and impressions of the talks and promises given by the participating countries? So were discussions based mostly on rhetorics, or did you notice some countries being serious with their promises and commitments?
A challenging question. Let me try to unpack that from a couple of different perspectives. First of all, we see not only an increasing number of pledges, we also see an increasing amount of scrutiny. So, for instance, at the Egypt COP, the UN high-level expert group on net zero released its report looking at different net zero targets and how to make sure that they are actually credible and accountable. So it's not enough anymore just to announce a pledge with a press release. I think there's going to be increasing scrutiny and follow-up on whether these targets are actually being met. Perhaps my second point would be that we do see countries that have a perhaps relatively robust pledge or a target for reducing emissions, but we also witness at the same time lack of action to actually reach that target. So this is a big challenge, and we talk about the implementation gap because of this in so many countries. However, I would also add that we also see the reverse of this in some countries. So, for instance, China has quite consistently underpledged and overachieved. So what they pledge under international frameworks such as the Paris Agreement is relatively modest, but then they do more than they have promised under these agreements. And why this is the case is a longer story, but you see also this happening. We have a number of countries that have pledged less than they are likely to do, even with existing policies.
Interesting, because I think that often the expectation is that the countries will, of course, deliver less than they promise, but that's an interesting point. Okay, we don't have any more questions at the moment, but please don't be discouraged to continue with them. But to get back to the issue of global north and south, because I think that's also a really interesting division and point here, which of course has been existing for a long time in the COPs. But I felt like when I was reading some of the, especially like Twitter commentary, this time it felt like the division seems to be even just getting stronger, and there are so many issues, of course, there that are involved, and even this loss and damage fund, which of course now was a kind of a breakthrough, but it seems like it's quite understandably not enough, especially in its present form, for the global south. So how do you see, both of you, maybe again we can start with Oras, but how do you see the sort of future development on this issue?
Can you rephrase that, on this issue being?
The division between, or kind of rift between global south and north.
Yeah. I think it's a very contested issue. It remains a very contested issue. We have a number of countries from the global south reverting to what was already in the 1992 UNFCCC, which is the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which basically had this bifurcation of so-called industrialized countries and then so-called developing countries, which originated in 92 at a time when the world was very different from where it is today. And it is in the self-interest of many countries in the global south to stick to this very old division into groups of countries. And we saw that again in Egypt in many statements from countries like China and others. At the same time, the Paris Agreement framework, by and large, is built on a different understanding of world order. It has commitments for all countries, regardless of their economic status. And I think the battle of these two paradigms is still very much active. Also, it was in Egypt, and I think it continues to be the case. I did refer to diversifying the sources of funding for the loss and damage fund. Of course, the assumption has always been that it is the industrialized countries that need to contribute, but the EU has been fighting to make sure that we should start considering wealthy countries like Israel, South Korea, Singapore, Qatar, that are wealthy but not officially considered industrialized countries. So I think this is a very much an ongoing debate.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks. How about Marco? Would you like to comment on that?
Yeah, so on the north-south division, well, the agreement on loss and damage could be seen as a positive step, and perhaps another positive step, not just in terms of this division, but in general, is the fact that with political changes in Brazil recently, it was stated that Brazil is returning to the UNFCCC framework. And this came, of course, just a year or year and a half after the US returned to this framework too. At the same time, I would still stress the fact that there hasn't been sufficient attention to major developments. For example, in 2021 and 2022, the IPCC reports, which we discussed in a previous climate briefing, actually, which you also find on YouTube, they have not received sufficient attention, and they outline consequences that are different for the global north and the global south, by the way. So the attention that they received is often, as Oras mentioned in his presentation, from some venues that sometimes using sensationalist titles. But my impression is that so they are quite isolated, and even the sensationalism does not really attract attention anymore. So what is necessary is really a lot more mainstreaming of the effects, especially of the scientific evidence that IPCC reports include and including the different consequences for different parts of the world. It is clear that the global south is more affected. It is more affected also by the energy crisis that we are witnessing.
Yes, thank you. Sorry, I lost myself here for a moment. Okay, we have more questions from the audience, so let's get back to them. So first, Seppo Määttä asks, and I think this is also mainly for Oras, climate coalition of the ministers of finance is something that Finland has been very active from beginning of February 2019. So how visible was the climate coalition during the COP meeting?
To my knowledge, not particularly visible, and I think it's a testament to the fact that still we have climate discussions quite separate from finance discussions, economic discussions, or even environmental discussions. And I think one of the challenges in the future is to integrate some of these discussions better, because if you only have the climate ministers discussing climate policy, then that's not going to take us where we need to be. So we need to have the finance ministers better involved in these discussions. And I think the coalition that Finland has been working on for a long time and has been very active on for a long time is a really good start, but I think it hasn't yet had the impact on the negotiations.
Right, that's interesting that there still are these sectoral divisions, even though the COP processes have been going on for a long time, and you would think kind of that there is a need also for this comprehensive thinking. Then we have a question from Julia Yamineva, also to Oras. Could you elaborate on China's role at this COP? Has it shown any willingness to contribute to the just announced fund on loss and damage, for instance?
On China's role more broadly, I think China is clever enough oftentimes to use proxies in these negotiations. If you want to be a bit more blunt, you could say that they use human shields. So when they have their own selfish interests, they want to defend in these negotiations rather than be open about them and take the blame. They use often poorer and more vulnerable countries in the global south as their mouthpieces. And I think this we could see also in Egypt. China's own interventions are relatively modest. They don't want to attract the attention of international media and civil society so much, but they do play in the back rooms and use other countries as their proxies. Regarding the loss and damage fund, China explicitly said that on the one hand, it is willing to contribute voluntarily, and mostly through bilateral South-South cooperation. And at the same time, it also made very clear that they are under no obligation under the Paris Agreement or any other treaty to provide these funds. So they want to be very strict about their sovereignty and being able to decide for themselves whether they contribute or not.
Right, interesting. Then we have a question from Hannes Tuohiniitty, and this is specifically to Marco. Have you noticed competing policy regimes in South Europe regarding partnering with Africa on energy projects? And he adds that his understanding is that Spain is not very interested in developing natural gas imports, and there are high-level plans in the EU institutions on hydrogen imports. So hopefully green hydrogen. So would you like to comment on that, Marco?
Yes, thanks. Well, I think the key question is here not so much about Spanish interest, but what's available really. Algeria has been underinvesting for a long time. On top of this, there are issues even with the existing infrastructure. For example, one of the two main pipelines that exports Algerian gas to Spain has been closed due to a conflict between Algeria and Morocco already for over a year, if I remember correctly, or for a year at least. Investing in Algerian gas is not so easy for Sonatrach because they keep very low domestic prices. With regard to imports of gas and oil from Libya, to Italy, these are not fully reliable due to the security situation in the country. So there isn't much room for additional gas imports at the moment from North Africa. And even the REPowerEU plan, which is maybe optimistic in some respects, does not really stress additional gas imports from there. It does stress, as you hinted at in your question, hydrogen imports, green hydrogen. And there is a plan to import 10 billion, the equivalent of 10 billion cubic meters of green hydrogen, especially from North Africa by 2030. However, there are questions. So this is just a plan on paper now. There are questions also in terms of water availability, soil availability on the spot. I think we are at a very early stage when it comes to hydrogen imports.
Right, interesting. Oras, do you have anything you would like to add to that question, or?
Perhaps just a more general observation, and I was just recently in Hungary meeting with the energy officials there to try to get a slightly different perspective on what this crisis looks like in different parts of Europe. I would just say that when it comes to these crisis measures that are not fully in line with our climate goals and ambitions, I think what really matters is to what extent they are absolutely necessary to keep the lights on, and to what extent they are temporary, and to what extent the capacities are kind of appropriate for the need in question. And I think the real concern here is that we end up making investments that have lifetimes of 20, 30 years in the future. And if we look at the pathways we have in Europe, there is no space for emissions coming from fossil fuels in 20 or 30 years of time. So those would become stranded assets, as Marco suggested earlier. So what we would need to make sure is that if we invest in solutions that are based on fossil fuels, they are temporary crisis measures, and they do not lock us in to a high carbon future.
Exactly, that's a very useful sort of categorization for evaluating these. And actually, as a follow-up to especially Oras, maybe Marco can also comment. But what's your take on what is the sort of policymakers' level of understanding of this time frame on the one hand, and then the sort of the long-term investments that are now being made in order to survive the crisis? So do the policymakers in general understand the sort of dilemma here? Oras, if you want to go first.
Well, I think the answer is no. If you look at many of the plans and projects in Europe currently being considered, I think that's the only conclusion you can come to. And it's not only the fact that there are considerations of investing in projects and infrastructure that would be there in 20, 30 years of time. There are also projects being considered that would start having an impact on our energy system in 2 or 3 years, which is hopefully at a time when we are already beyond the current energy crisis. So they would, at the one hand, lock us in to a high carbon scenario, and on the other, they would basically not help with the current energy crisis. So I think there is a mismatch here.
Exactly. How about Marco?
Well, yes, I agree. I mean, it's possible that they do understand, but the pressure is really on short-term measures now, especially that the energy crisis high energy prices can have a huge impact on political support in the short run. And this is one of the most unfortunate consequences of what is happening now. We see this also within the European Union. Governments are prioritizing climate action. I mean, I know the case of Italy best. But yeah, as a general question, I think that this is the key point at the moment. And so far, well, the European Green Deal tried to, after the COVID crisis, to connect economic recovery to decarbonization. But now I think we are sort of losing the momentum in the wake of the worsening of the energy crisis.
Yeah, unfortunately, this seems to be the case a little bit. We are also not losing momentum, but we are running out of time in this webinar. And there is still one more question from the audience, and I think it actually kind of links up to something that I wanted to ask you as a last question and sort of summing up your remarks. There is a question from Petteri Haveri about the G20 meeting in Bali, which was taking place at the same time with the COP27, and he wonders if the global climate negotiations will happen between a smaller group of nations increasingly in the future. And this is linked to something that I was wondering about also earlier, that with especially the COP meetings, annual meetings that take place, being such a huge circus nowadays, do you think that there is a future for them? And will the negotiations, would it make sense to have them more in some other format, or maybe with smaller meetings, or something that would make it a bit less of an event and maybe also easier than to organize? Or is it still important to have this annual meeting? So let's start with Oras again.
This is a recurring discussion that is not entirely new. And your colleague Antto Vihma, for instance, has done some studies on these regional or sub-global settings for climate action. I think probably these different approaches are going to coexist in the future. There is a place for global and multilateral action and negotiations. And I think there is a place for smaller settings, be it regional or be it climate clubs, so coalitions of the willing countries that are willing to go further and earlier than some others, trying to cooperate among themselves. I think these two approaches probably will coexist. I think it's easy enough to say that COPs are in many ways problematic and not perfect. I think it's much more challenging to come up with alternatives that are realistic, feasible, and can deliver. And I think that is one of the reasons why we'll probably have COPs also in the future. I would just like to remind everyone that one of the attractions in these COPs is that they bring everyone together. It's big and small, it's wealthy and poor, it's the relatively less vulnerable and the most vulnerable countries of the world. And if we did not have this platform for this type of dialogue, I think we would have to come up with something to provide the same type of opportunity for dialogue. The other thing I would just like to point out that even though COPs are in many ways imperfect, they do still get a lot of attention of world leaders and media for at least 2 weeks out of 52 in a year on climate action or the lack thereof. So I think it is helpful to have this international spotlight every year. And if we did not have the COPs, I think we would have to come up with something else to get that attention to climate policy.
Exactly, that's very true. Marco, let's give you the last word. What's your take?
Well, I'll just add maybe 2 points. So focusing on this issue of smaller groups, I mean, in addition to COP negotiations, so this is the clubs scenario where groups of countries cooperate also in sharing technology. So besides negotiations, and the energy transition takes place at different speeds. I mean, this of course puts strain on collective efforts, or it can put strain, because, for example, if you have different speeds and countries not sharing technology because they are competing, then you will have the imposition of carbon taxes because you want to avoid losing industrial production. So if this scenario happens, then it can become more, it will become more competitive, and it can become more conflictual as well, and result in a slower pace of change.
All right, that's very reasonable, good points from both of you to end with. And as we are out of time, I must unfortunately end the webinar, but it's been a really interesting and good discussion, I think, and very illuminating on both the COP27 and the future steps and also the geopolitical aspects. So thank you very much to both of our great speakers, and thanks also for the audience for sticking around. And thank you.